In the spring of 1349, a Carmelite friar named Jean de Venette sat down in Paris and wrote something that has been surviving in archives ever since, largely because nobody who reads it can quite believe it. He was describing the nursing sisters of the Hôtel Dieu, the great hospital on the Ile de la Cité in the shadow of Notre Dame, and what he wrote was not an accusation or a complaint. It was a kind of stunned, helpless admiration. The sisters, he wrote, not fearing to die, tended the sick with all sweetness and humility. New sisters replaced those who died, to their great merit. Read that again slowly. New sisters replaced those who died, not because the previous group had retired, not because they had been reassigned, because they were dead. The hospital had burned through an entire cohort of nursing sisters, the way a fire burns through kindling, and new women had walked in to take their places, fully aware of what had happened to everyone who stood where they were standing. The order had to recruit replacements multiple times over the course of a single year. And the thing that should genuinely unsettle you about that story is not the dying, it's the arriving. It's the moment each new sister walked through that door, past the smell, past whatever she had already heard about what was happening inside, and picked up where the last dead woman had left off. That is not a story about ignorance. That is a story about something considerably harder to look at directly. You would not have survived a single night inside that building. And over the next several minutes, I'm going to take you through exactly what was happening in there, hour by hour, ward by ward, starting with what a medieval hospital actually was, because it was almost certainly not what you're picturing. The first thing most people get wrong about medieval hospitals is the word itself. When you hear hospital, you picture medicine, physicians, treatments, some version, however crude, of the process of trying to make sick people well. That is not what the Hôtel Dieu was. That is not what any medieval hospital was. The word comes from the Latin hospes, meaning guest or stranger. A hospital was, at its core, a house of hospitality, a place where the church received the suffering poor and cared for their souls while their bodies did whatever bodies were going to do. The Hôtel Dieu of Paris had been doing exactly that since 651 AD, when Saint Landry, Bishop of Paris, founded it on the bank of the Seine. That makes it the oldest hospital in the world, still in operation today. A record it holds not because it was spectacularly effective, but because it was spectacularly committed. For nearly 7 centuries before the Black Death arrived, it had been feeding the hungry, sheltering the destitute, and providing somewhere for the dying to die with a priest nearby. That last function turned out to be the most important one, and it shaped everything about how the building operated. A medieval hospital was a religious institution that occasionally practiced medicine. The two goals were not always compatible. Saving your soul and saving your body pulled in different directions more often than anyone was willing to admit. And in 1349, when the plague arrived in Paris, the soul won by a considerable margin. This distinction matters because it changes what you understand about the experience of being admitted. You did not go to the Hôtel Dieu hoping to get better. That was not a realistic expectation in 1349, and on some level, everyone involved understood this. You went to the Hôtel Dieu to die in a state of grace, with your sins confessed, your last rites administered, and a record of your Christian death preserved by the institution. The hospital was, in a very precise sense, a managed death. The question was only how long the management took. Understanding that is the key to understanding everything else. Because once you walk through the door knowing it, the building stops being a place of failed medicine and becomes something considerably stranger and more haunting. A place where people went indeliberately to receive care they knew would not save them, administered by women they knew were dying in the process, organized by a church that believed suffering itself was sacred. A place built entirely on the proposition that dying well mattered more than not dying. You arrived at the Hôtel Dieu in 1349 in one of two conditions, carried or walking. If you were carried, a lay brother brought you in on a stretcher from wherever you had collapsed. If you were walking, you had made the choice yourself, which meant you had already assessed your own situation and reached a conclusion about where you were headed. The building that received you sat directly beside Notre Dame, separated from it by perhaps 30 feet of cobblestone. It was not a single structure, but a complex of several interconnected buildings extending along the southern bank of the Seine, with a series of long ward halls, a cloister, chapels, a kitchen, and the dormitories where the sisters slept. directly adjacent to the wards, with no meaningful separation between the women's sleeping quarters and the rooms where plague patients lay dying. This is not a detail. This is the entire story of why the sisters kept dying. When you entered in 1349, a sister received you. She was an Augustinian, part of the religious order that had run the hospital since the 12th century. She was not a physician. She was not trained in medicine in any formal sense. She was trained in prayer, in nursing in the original sense of that word. Washing bodies, changing linens, administering food and drink, and in the spiritual comfort of the dying. She asked your name. She noted whether you had received confession. If you had not, a priest came immediately. Before anyone assessed your physical condition in any systematic way, your soul was assessed. Then they put you in a bed. And here is where you need to brace yourself, because the bed situation at the Hôtel Dieu in 1349 is one of those historical details that sounds like it must be an exaggeration, until you realize it's been corroborated by enough independent sources that there is simply no getting around it. The beds were shared, not in the sense that two healthy people share a bed, in the sense that 3, 4, and sometimes more patients occupied the same narrow wooden frame simultaneously, ready packed in together regardless of what was wrong with any of them. A patient admitted with plague lay alongside a patient with a broken leg, alongside a patient with a fever of unknown origin, alongside someone who had died in the night and not yet been removed. The linen between them was changed when someone thought to change it, which in ordinary times was regularly enough, and in 1349 was not. The historian Daniel Jacquard has documented the bed-sharing practice at Hôtel Dieu, noting that it was not considered cruel or negligent by the standards of the time. It was simply the arithmetic of available space meeting the volume of human suffering. The hospital had been built for somewhere between 300 and 400 patients. In 1349, it held considerably more than that. The overflow spilled into corridors, into the courtyard, in the worst weeks, and into the street outside. And that bed you were now lying in, it smelled. Everything in the building smelled, in ways that were perceptible from outside on the street, in ways that the sisters had simply stopped registering because there was no registering it anymore. The miasma theory, the prevailing medical belief that corrupt air caused disease, should have led to extraordinary efforts at fumigation in a plague hospital, and indeed, there were such efforts. Incense burned in braziers in the ward halls. Herbs were scattered across the floors: rosemary, juniper, lavender, wormwood. The sisters moved through their duties surrounded by a haze of smoke designed to neutralize the corrupt air rising from dying bodies. The smoke did not neutralize anything. What it did do was layer one smell over another in a way that several contemporary accounts suggest was somehow worse than either smell alone. Jean de Venette, writing from Paris, described the atmosphere of the city during the plague in terms that make it clear the hospital occupied a particular category of olfactory horror, even within a city that had become broadly uninhabitable by smell. He was not a squeamish writer. The hospital apparently managed to affect him anyway. Now, the treatment. This is where I need you to set aside everything you currently know about medicine, because what you know is going to make it harder, not easier, to understand what they were doing and why. They were not fumbling in the dark. They were following a sophisticated, internally consistent, centuries-old framework for understanding the human body. That framework was wrong in almost every particular, but it was not chaos. It was method, and that makes it worse. The dominant medical theory of 1349 was humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks through Arabic scholars and transmitted across Europe through university medical education. Your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health meant these 4 substances existed in proper balance. Disease meant one had grown excessive or corrupted. Treatment meant restoring balance, which in practice meant removing the excess humor by one of several unpleasant methods. Bloodletting was the default. A physician, if one was available, and in 1349 many of them were not, because they had fled or died, would open a vein in your arm or neck and drain blood into a bowl. Is the quantity determined by your apparent condition and the physician's assessment of which humor was out of proportion. This was not done once. It was repeated at intervals as your condition progressed. Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to Pope Clement VI and one of the most respected surgeons in Europe, wrote about this period with an honesty that is almost shocking coming from a man of his stature. Physicians, he admitted, felt useless and ashamed because they did not dare visit the sick for fear of infection, and when they did visit them, they could do very little and accomplish nothing. He contracted the plague himself, suffered a continuous fever and a swollen bubo in his groin, and somehow survived, which he attributed partly to his constitution and partly to the fires Clement kept burning in his chambers, all which may have unknowingly repelled the fleas that were actually spreading the disease. Guy de Chauliac was one of the most brilliant physicians of his era. His luck, rather than his medicine, saved him. In the hospital, when a physician did appear, the first step was uroscopy, the examination of your urine. A physician would study a flask of it held up to the light, assessing its color, its clarity, its smell, its consistency, sometimes its taste. From this examination, he would pronounce on the state of your humors and prescribe accordingly: bloodletting, purging, emetics to induce vomiting, all aimed at expelling the corrupted matter that was, according to the theory, causing your collapse. The buboes, those characteristic swellings in the groin, armpits, ear and neck that marked plague with particular clarity, received their own treatments. A physician would lance them with a knife, attempting to drain the poison within. If lancing didn't satisfy, cauterization followed, a heated iron pressed against the swelling to burn away the corrupted flesh. One remedy that circulated with genuine enthusiasm involved taking a live chicken, plucking the feathers from its rear, and pressing the bare skin of the bird directly against the bubo. The theory was that the chicken would draw the poison out of your body and into its own. The chicken, predictably, died. So did the patient. Theriac, a compound of up to 80 ingredients including myrrh, viper flesh, cinnamon, and opiates, was considered the universal antidote to poison and disease since antiquity. It was expensive, prestigious, wine completely inert against plague. Physicians prescribed it, patients believed in it. It made no difference whatsoever. None of it did. And here is what should stop you cold. The physicians knew this, not in the abstract, not in retrospect, but in the moment in 1349. They knew their treatments weren't working, and they didn't know why, and they kept applying them anyway because they had nothing else. Guy de Chauliac wrote it down. Several others wrote it down. The historical record of 1349 is full of physicians and scholars documenting their own helplessness with a precision that is somehow more devastating than ignorance would have been. The sisters documented nothing because documentation was not their job and literacy was not universal among them. But they saw everything the physicians saw and more. They saw it up close and continuously without the option of fleeing that many physicians took. And they kept showing up. Here is what most people don't know about the women who ran the Hôtel Dieu. They had chosen this life deliberately. The Augustinian order was not a punishment or a default destination for women with no other options. It was a vocation chosen by women who had internalized a specific and demanding theology of suffering. The idea, drawn from the Gospels and elaborated by centuries of church teaching, that caring for the sick was not merely charitable but sacred, that in the body of a plague patient you encountered something of God. That service offered in the face of death carried a weight that ordinary service did not. This theology was not a comfort in any sense you would recognize. It was demanding in a way that modern secular care work simply isn't, because it asked the sisters not just to do the nursing, but to mean it, to approach each dying patient as an encounter with something beyond the merely physical, to sustain that approach across 12-hour shifts, across weeks, across a year in which the people dying around them included their colleagues, their friends, and eventually the replacements of those friends. The sisters slept, when they slept, in dormitories abutting the plague wards. There was no protected distance, no PPE, no protocol for minimizing exposure. They washed the bodies of plague patients with their bare hands, changed linens saturated with plague effluent, administered water and food to patients coughing blood. Their theology told them this contact was holy. Their bodies told them nothing at all, because no one in 1349 had any concept of contagion in the modern sense. The idea that an invisible living agent could travel from a sick body to a healthy one and cause the same disease was not available to them. They did not wear gloves because there was no reason within their understanding of the world to wear gloves. When the plague reached Paris in 1348, the sisters began dying. not all at once, not in ways that immediately distinguished plague from ordinary mortality. One sister with a fever, another with swollen nodes in her neck, a third whose breathing had changed. By the time the pattern was unmistakable, it was unmistakable only in retrospect. By the time the order recognized it had lost most of its Paris membership, the replacement sisters were already arriving. Jean de Venette noted this. He thought it was magnificent. He was right, and that is not a simple thing to hold. By nightfall in the Hôtel Dieu, the ward had reached its particular nighttime character. Medieval hospitals followed a religious schedule. The canonical hours governed the sisters' day as completely as any monastery, which meant that, at Compline, the final prayer of the evening, the wards grew quieter, the lamps dimmer, the sisters moving through the rows of beds with less urgency and more deliberateness. A priest walked the ward. Last rites were administered wherever they were needed, which in 1349 was nearly continuously. The sounds of the ward at night had a specific texture that several sources from plague hospitals in this period try to describe, and none of them quite manage. Breathing that labored in particular ways. Coughing, occasionally a voice, calling out for a family member or for water, or saying nothing recognizable at all. The sound of a body being moved, the sound of prayer, the sound of the Seine outside the walls, continuous and indifferent. What the darkness could not hide was the smell, which was comprehensive and all-directional and attached itself to everything in the building, including the stone walls. The incense kept burning through the night. It was not decorative. The sisters burned it in the sincere belief that it was protection, that the purified air was meaningfully safer than unpurified air. By 1349, the evidence available to them did not disprove this. The sisters who burned the most incense died at the same rate as those who burned less, but no one was tracking that data. Or if you survived the night, and many patients did not, you woke to the morning prayer and the beginning of another rotation of treatments. Bloodletting was often performed in the morning. Urine collected overnight was examined. Food arrived, a thin pottage, bread, occasionally broth. The hospital maintained a kitchen, and the sisters cooked for the patients with the same systematic devotion they brought to everything else. The food was not part of any treatment plan in the modern sense. It was sustenance, offered because the theology required that the body be sustained as long as it was present. And then the cycle began again. Here is the darkest irony in the entire history of the Hôtel Dieu. And it requires one piece of information you did not have in 1349 and would not have for another 5 centuries. Plague was spread by fleas carried by rats, not by air, not by corrupted humors, not by the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which the University of Paris had officially determined was the cause. By fleas, specifically by Xenocilla chiopis, a rat flea that infected the human bloodstream with Yersinia pestis when it bit. A building packed with hundreds of dying and dead bodies, surrounded by the Seine, a river actively used as a dump for plague corpses, sewage, and slaughterhouse waste. In a city where rats moved freely through every structure, where straw covered every floor, where the precise, warm, crowded conditions in which fleas thrive were replicated with meticulous consistency in every ward. The Hôtel Dieu was not a hospital. It was an amplification system. It was the single most efficient mechanism available in 1349 for concentrating infected fleas in proximity to the maximum number of humans. The sisters did not know this. No one knew this. And because no one knew this, the response to the plague spread through the hospital was to do more of what was already being done. More prayer, more theriac, more incense, more bloodletting, more plucked chickens pressed against swollen lymph nodes, in the sincere hope that this time, for this patient, it would work. The hospital did not adapt because there was nothing in any available framework of understanding that suggested it should adapt. The medicine was perfect by its own logic. The patients kept dying. In the aftermath of the Black Death, yet something remarkable happened to the structure of European hospital care, and it happened precisely because the plague made it obvious that the existing system was catastrophically insufficient. Cities that had watched their plague hospitals become killing grounds began building the first institutions that resembled, however faintly, a modern conception of patient isolation. Venice established what would become a formal lazaretto, a quarantine island, as early as 1423. Milan under the Visconti experimented with isolating plague houses. The concept of separating the sick from the healthy, physically, structurally, as a matter of public policy rather than private charity, traces a direct line from the catastrophic lessons of 1349. The Hôtel Dieu itself was eventually redesigned in the 18th century. In 1772, a series of fires destroyed several of its wards, and when it was rebuilt, the new design included something the old building had never had: single patient beds. The decision was made partly for humanitarian reasons, and partly because by the 1770s, medicine had finally begun to accept that disease could travel between patients sharing a bed. It took 4 centuries after the Black Death to reach that conclusion. 4 centuries of shared beds. 4 centuries of that particular geometry of the dying. The Augustinian sisters continued to run the hospital through all of it. They were still there in the 18th century. They are still there today. Their order maintains a presence at the modern Hôtel Dieu, which still operates as a hospital on the Île de la Cité, steps from Notre Dame. The building has been rebuilt and modernized beyond recognition. The sisters wear different habits now. The medicine works. Everything is different. And yet, Jean de Venette wrote what he wrote in 1349 about women who knew what was happening, who had watched their colleagues die, and who kept arriving to take their places anyway. Not fearing to die, he wrote, new sisters replaced those who died. He meant it as praise. It was praise. And it is also one of the most precise and devastating descriptions of a system that consumed the people inside it as efficiently as it consumed the patients, quietly, continuously, without drama, and without end. In the spring of 1349, a sister arrived at the Hôtel Dieu for her first shift. Someone told her where to go. She picked up the linens of the woman who had died in that role before her. She walked into the ward. The incense was burning. The patients were praying or moaning or silent. The Seine moved outside the walls. The rats moved through the straw. She had come to help. She brought everything she had. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, and she was there anyway. That is not a failure of medicine. It is something considerably harder to name. And the fact that it happened continuously for an entire year, while medicine offered plucked chickens and philosophy offered planetary conjunctions, that is what the Hôtel Dieu of 1349 actually was. Not a hospital, not a death house. Something in between that we don't quite have a word for. Built by people who understood precisely one thing with absolute clarity: that the dying should not be alone. Everything else they got wrong. That one thing they never got wrong. And if you had walked through that door in 1349, that one thing is the only mercy you would have found waiting for you on the other side.